Government reform will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Appreciate you all being here. We have an important topic today to talk about the potential of $125 billion in savings that has been ignored, and we're going to have a discussion about the review of the Department of Defense's efficiency study. On December 5th of 2016, the Washington Post reported on a Department of Defense study that found the Pentagon could potentially save $125 billion over 5 years on back-office non-combat expenses. The Post's story detailed the desire of DoD leadership to squelch the findings of the Defense Business Board, sometimes referred to as the DBB, but the Defense Business Board, for fear that Congress would ultimately end up cutting their budget. That's the concern. The DBB is an advisory board commissioned by the Pentagon to provide independent advice and recommendations with regard to governance and management at the Department of Defense. For this study, the Defense Business Board was charged with finding savings the Pentagon could recapitalize into more troops, more ships, and more planes. Enlisting the management consulting firm of McKinsey & Company, one of the premier consulting companies we have in this country, the DBB spent months analyzing the Pentagon's business systems and back-office operations. The result of the report concluded the Department of Defense could save billions from overhauling its back-office functions, including contract management, IT, business processes, real estate, and human resource management. These savings can be reinvested to better equip our men and women in uniform, but the Department of Defense leadership squelched the report. In response to the Post story, 31 members of this committee from both sides of the aisle signed a letter to then-Secretary Carter asking for answers. With the change in administrations, the urgent need for reform at the Pentagon has not changed. There are a number of statistics that tend to support the DBB's recommendation for rigorous oversight. First, the Pentagon continues to expand its use of contractors. From 2001 to 2015, the Department of Defense increased the number of civilian employees by roughly 14%. Compared to our men and women in uniform, government contractors are less likely to be subject to oversight of the Pentagon. Some of the government's most effective tools for holding its employees accountable are not available when it comes to contractors. Second, the Pentagon study noted the potential $125 billion savings could fund 50 Army brigades or 10 Navy carrier strike group deployments or 83 Air Force F-35 fighter wings. So while our troops are engaging in the enemy in Iraq and Syria and patrolling the South China Sea and really helping make sure that this world in the United States is a safe place, the Pentagon is resistant to back-office cuts that would better fund and equip these men and women who are doing the hard work on the front lines. Given how dangerous our world is, we really, truly have to get this right. And if we're going to ensure our troops are the best equipped possible, it is our responsibility to oversee how this money is expended. It is a lot of money. It's the single biggest line item in our discretionary spending budget. The Constitution delegates to Congress the role of providing the training and equipment of the Army and to, quote, maintain a Navy, end quote. It is our job to make sure that our warfighters are getting all the support that they need to do their job. So we have a very astute panel, and we look forward to having a discussion with them about this report and what can be done to save money at the Pentagon. With that, I will yield my time back and now recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this critical hearing today. The Department of Defense is charged with the most serious mission areas: protecting and defending every man, woman, child in our country. In this dangerous world, the readiness of our warfighters is essential to national security, and Congress has a duty to provide our military with all the necessary resources. However, we also have a duty to ensure that every taxpayer's dollar is put to its most effective and efficient use. Every dollar that is squandered through waste, duplication, or fraud is a dollar not available for military training, advanced weaponry, and salaries and benefits for our uniformed and non-uniformed personnel. It is also a dollar we do not have for critical domestic programs like education, job training, and feeding the poor. In January 2015, the Defense Business Board, a panel that provides management advice from a private sector perspective, issued a study finding, and I quote, "a clear path to saving over $125 billion in the next 5 years," end of quote. Last December, a Washington Post story written by Bob Woodward and his colleagues reported allegations that Pentagon leadership deliberately buried the study amid fears that Congress might reduce the defense budget. On December 8th, all committee Democrats and 31 total committee members signed a bipartisan letter requesting information about this report and these allegations. The Defense Department disputes the amount in the report, the $125 billion over 5 years. But nobody disputes that the Defense Department could save billions of dollars by streamlining the way it conducts business. Senator John McCain and Representative Mac Thornberry, chairman of the Senate and House Armed Service Committees, issued the following joint statement on this study, and I quote, "The Defense Business Board's key findings that the Department of Defense could save as much as $125 billion over 5 years by eliminating unnecessary back-office bureaucracy are not a surprise," end of quote. Nor are the problems identified by the Board new. We have known for many years that the Department's business practices are archaic and wasteful, and its inability to pass a clean audit is a long-standing travesty. In the United States of America, we have one department that just cannot get through an audit. That is amazing. This is also not new to this committee. We've done years of work examining wasteful spending at the Defense Department. Just last month, the Comptroller General of the United States testified before us that, and I quote, "probably a third of the areas on the high-risk list are DoD business management practices," end of quote. The Defense Department is the only federal agency that has never passed an independent audit. I wonder if they're spending too much money to be able to do an audit. And then we hear that the President wants another $54 billion, and here we have a report that says we can save $125 billion in 5 years. But President Trump's new budget ignores all of this. He proposes boosting defense spending by billions and billions of dollars. He proposes funding this increase by slashing dozens of critical programs that promote our national security and our nation's most vulnerable communities, the elderly, children, and the rural working class. The President would slash funding for the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development, reducing contributions for UN peacekeeping, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that monitors Iran's compliance with the nuclear agreement, and the World Bank's anti-poverty programs. The President would decimate foreign aid for humanitarian efforts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Nepal, as well as anti-drug trafficking efforts in Latin America. Last month, more than 120 former generals signed a letter to Congress warning that, and I quote, "the State Department, USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, Peace Corps, and other development agencies are critical to preventing conflict and reducing the need to put our men and women in uniform in harm's way." In 2013, Defense Secretary James Mattis, who was then serving as the commander of CENTCOM, testified, and I quote, "If you don't fully fund the State Department, I need to buy more ammunition ultimately. The more that we put into the State Department's diplomacy, hopefully, the less we have to put into a military budget," end of quote. The President's budget also weakens our maritime border and airport security by redirecting billions of dollars from the Coast Guard and TSA to constructing an outrageously expensive wall on the border with Mexico. But to me, the most disturbing cuts are to critical domestic programs. The President would eliminate community development block grants, which fund anti-poverty programs like Meals on Wheels, which feeds approximately 2.4 million of our elderly citizens, veterans, and other homebound individuals every year. The President would also eliminate funding for the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, which helps fund after-school programs serving more than 1.6 million children across the country, many of them in low-income neighborhoods. The President's budget does not effectively serve our national security interests, nor does it serve the interests of the everyday American family. The United States must invest in a strong national defense to face our global challenges. This means not just spending more, but spending wisely. And so I want to thank all of the witnesses for being with us today and for their valuable contributions toward improving the Defense Department's effectiveness and the national security of all of our Americans. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I will hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who wish to submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our panel of witnesses. We're pleased to welcome Mr. David Tillotson, the 3rd Acting Deputy Chief Management Officer from the United States Department of Defense. Mr. Scott Rutherford, Senior Partner at McKinsey & Company. Mr. Michael Baer, current Chairman of the Defense Business Board. Mr. Robert Stein, former Chairman of the Defense Business Board. Mr. Kenneth Klepper, former board member of the Defense Business Board, and the Honorable Lawrence Korb, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. We thank you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses are to be sworn before they testify. So if you will please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Tillotson, we will start with you, and we'll go right on down the line. You'll each be recognized for 5 minutes. If you'd please limit your testimony to those 5 minutes so members have chance to ask you questions. We have a big panel today. Your entire written statement and any attachments will be made part of the official record. Mr. Tillotson, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee. As my written statement will be entered into the record, I will keep my remarks brief in the interest of giving you time to ask whatever questions the committee chooses to ask. I will say a couple of things very quickly, however. I think the one thing that is that I would take unequivocal issue with is that the report was in any way suppressed. It was actively discussed within the Department at the time. It has formed the basis of discussions since that time. It was posted in the public record. It was actually discussed with members of the House and Senate back in 2015, shortly after it was issued, albeit not with this committee, but with the HASC and SASC. So fact is, this has not been suppressed. The actions that led to the results of the DBB report, among other things, were actually kicked off by the current Deputy Secretary of Defense, acting through my office. 2 actions were taken. One, we initiated a contract through the DCMO office to Ryan Consulting to do some work on understanding where the costs of the department rested in terms of backshop activities. So this was a deliberate attempt on the part of the department to, in fact, identify the opportunity space not associated with directly associated with Defense Business Board. Ryan Consulting, in turn, subcontracted to McKinsey. So that's the relationship to that company. The second activity was that the Deputy Secretary chartered the Defense Business Board at the time to do a corporate-style review, looking at the information generated by McKinsey and coming up with recommendations about how the department might proceed to address opportunities generated by whatever the cost opportunities presented us. So those were the actions that were taken. The question about moving forward on efficiencies is hardly new to the department. Secretary Gates led a significant efficiency initiative that resulted in multiple billions of dollars repurposed within the department. Secretary Hagel continued that tradition. Secretary Carter continues to do so. After the study was published, several things got addressed. There were two concrete areas for recommendations in the report and a third recommendation that basically said, go do some more homework. We acted on the two concrete recommendations, which were to address some IT efficiencies. We have not gone as far as the report would suggest we could. I agree with that. We also pushed ahead on some services contract reviews, particularly on the OSD staff, the defense agencies, and field activities, an area where, candidly, not as much attention had been rendered as needed to have been done in the past. When we look at the result of those sets of actions, that added an additional $7.9 billion in efficiencies to an already double-digit billions of efficiencies that we had put in place in prior years. Having said all that, there is more to do. There is ample opportunity. The DBB report, the supporting McKinsey material would suggest there are things we can do. There are two challenges to moving forward. I will be candid about both. There is an internal challenge. That's our job. We will go fight those battles. We have to have those discussions internal to the department. And in some instances, we are assisted by actions on the Hill. So in the most recent National Defense Authorization Bill in 2017, there was a very specific requirement for us to redirect and look at the management of the medical community in the Department of Defense. We agree from the DCMO's office that that is worth looking at. We certainly would endorse moving forward with that, and we appreciate the support of Congress in doing that. Having said that, efficiencies means we take a look at moving money and activities from current activities into new activities. One of the areas that both the GAO and the DBB report and independent DBB reports have all pointed at is our use of leased property and owned real property. It's intriguing to me that when we opt to let a lease contract for a building lapse, not terminate it, let the contract run out, that we spend 3 trips to a state delegation explaining why we can't close that contract. So I'm prepared, and the department is prepared, to work on this going forward. Mr. Korb, in a recent article, has suggested 5 steps that the department should build on, including build on the DBB report. We agree. But his 5th recommendation is a recommendation the department brings forward with regularity, and which, candidly, at least one member of this committee in a prior testimony has asked me if we thought we needed, and that is, do we need a BRAC? And the answer is yes. So there are actions that we need to take working in conjunction with Congress. By the way, BRAC is not the only action. I'm going to say that right now. It is not the only thing we should do. Thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Rutherford, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Chaffetz, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. My name is Scott Rutherford. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey & Company, and I'm the managing partner of the Washington, D.C. office. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss McKinsey's work for the Department of Defense under contract with the department's Deputy Chief Management Officer. From the fall of 2014 to the spring of 2015, we were engaged by the department to conduct a comprehensive assessment of its spending in 6 core business functions: human resource management, healthcare management, financial flow management, logistics and supply chain, acquisitions and procurement, and real property management. Our work began with the development of what we called a cost baseline, which assembled data on existing spending across the entire department in these 6 areas. To our knowledge, that kind of cross-cutting analysis of back-office spending at the DoD had never before been conducted. McKinsey's work has since been used by the department in a number of important ways. First, the Deputy Chief Management Officer shared our baseline with the DBB and that baseline was used by the Defense Business Board in its own analysis and report released in January 2015. Although the McKinsey baseline was a starting point for the DBB's efforts, and McKinsey is one of many inputs into their approach, the projections, assumptions, and analysis of the potential cost savings were those of the DBB. Second, McKinsey's work for the DoD continued using the cost baseline into what we would call benchmarking, which compares the department against other large companies, and rough sizing, which began the process of estimating the magnitude of the savings that might be achieved in different categories. So in May of 2015, McKinsey estimated that the department could achieve about $4 to $5 billion in new savings per year over a 5-year period across these 6 functional areas we examined. That translates into cumulative savings of between $62 billion and $84 billion over a 5-year period. Third, it's our understanding that the department has used our baseline, our benchmarks, and our cost savings estimates to implement changes on its own that are generating actual cost savings. The projected cost savings we identified are somewhat different than those estimated by the DBB's January 2015 report, because while both estimates started with the McKinsey baseline, McKinsey had the benefit of working collaboratively with the DoD, allowing us to drill down further and do additional analytical work for a couple of months afterwards. Based on that additional work, we also assumed a somewhat slower pace of change than the DBB assumed. This resulted in a lower estimate of how much savings could be achieved over the first 5 years relative to the DBB's projections. We're very proud of our work. We've been helping private sector and government agencies identify opportunities to reduce costs for many years and have accumulated a body of proprietary databases and methodologies that allow us to bring that experience to bear in very concrete ways. And in this case, we provided the department with a set of tools and approaches to move forward on realizing cost savings opportunities. And we believe the department's potential return on that investment it made in our effort is substantial. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. Baird, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Chaffetz and Ranking Minority Member Cummings and members of the committee. My last engagement with this committee was many years ago when my then boss, Bud Brown, was the ranking minority member of the then-named Government Operations Committee. But today I appear before you as the 5th chairman of the Defense Business Board. As are all the members of the Business Board, I am a private citizen, not a paid government employee. We all volunteer our time to serve the Department of Defense by offering our collective advice on how to manage the department more efficiently in order to enable the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary to maximize the allocation of scarce resources to the warfighter. The men and women of the Business Board and its sister advisory boards, Policy and Science, who donate their time and energy to help the department, each consider it a tremendous honor and a great responsibility. As I've communicated to you and your staff, I have no direct knowledge about the effort at hand. My first meeting after returning as chairman of the Defense Business Board was in July of 2015, more than 6 months after this study had ended and its presentation publicly in January of that year. As this was under the direction of a previous chairman, and long before I became chair, I have no particular insight or access into the actions and decisions made about how this effort was conducted or delivered. I can say in the year and a half since I became chairman, the board has been very busy. It's completed 8 studies, and our most recent effort, focusing at transition, was a product of every member of the board of the Defense Business Board, and it was very well received by the department's leadership at the time and the incoming leadership of Secretary Mattis's team. There is more work to be done in the months and years ahead as we all strive to support Secretary Mattis's priorities, particularly his third, and I quote, bringing business reforms to the Department of Defense, which we believe are essential for his ability to deliver the other 2. I will close with saying that this hearing appears from its title to be focused on what the department did or did not do with a particular study. and speaking for the Department is an inherently governmental function, and I, as a private citizen, am strictly prohibited from assuming that role, which makes appearing before you to discuss a study of this, which I wasn't part of, a bit challenging. My duties include speaking for the Business Board to the Department and others, but not speaking for the Department of Defense to anyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward. This concludes my opening remarks, and I look forward to your and Mr. Cummings and the rest of the members' questions.
Thank you, Mr. Baer. We now recognize Mr. Stein for 5 minutes.
Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to provide testimony today. Congressman Cummings, it is great seeing you again since our time on the Naval Academy Board of Visitors. My name is Bobby Stein, and I'm here to discuss the Department of Defense Efficiency Study commissioned by Secretary Hagel and created under my leadership as former chairman of the DoD Defense Business Board, known as the DBB. I was honored to serve as a member of the DBB between 2010 and 2014, and chairman from 2014 to 2015. As you know, the DBB is an advisory panel comprised of a select group of our nation's business leaders. Our purpose was to provide advice to the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Defense and other senior leaders on best practices that could be applied to DoD. My priority for the DBB was that members be not selected for any partisan reasons, but based on tried and true experience results in the business world. I was honored to serve because I understood our mission to be strengthening the defense of our country. I was appointed as chair of the DBB by then Secretary Hagel in 2014. After becoming chair, I went on a listening tour of senior retired uniform and non-uniform leadership to determine areas where the DBB could support the agency. During the listening tour, we took note of key facts and figures about how money was being spent. It generated concerns because, as a retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, the biggest threat to our national security is our national debt. Key takeaways included our national debt is $20 trillion. Our Federal Reserve's taken their balance sheet from $800 billion to $4.5 trillion. At the Pentagon, overhead and support comprise 40% of the spending, or $240 billion. This equals twice the combined total budgets, defense budgets of France and England. Expenses on DoD headquarters alone amounts to $40 billion, more than German defense budget. At the same time, since 2001, DoD civilian personnel has increased over 15%, but military personnel has decreased by 5%. And while everyone wants reform at the Pentagon, the status quo remains. The antibodies get you every time. Indeed, clean audits and services continue to fail. Some estimates we've spent $6 billion to try to get clean audits in our different departments. This listening tour predated the commissioning of the efficiency study, but highlights the importance of the effort. The DBB efficiency study was one of many reports undertaken by the DBB under my leadership. This study was the first effort ever in DoD history to comprehensively evaluate labor cost data and create a picture of how much money is being spent on non-combat operations at the agency. As the chair of the DBB during the study, I felt that my role was to help ensure that the study was done accurately so that we can meet our ultimate goal of identifying inefficiency and cost savings that could then be moved to better uses. In particular, I helped to identify the people with the right experience to handle this type of project. For something like this, you need a heart surgeon if you have a heart problem, not a country doctor, is said by one of the retired CNOs. And I've spent time looking for who that right person is and who can help that path to work with the Department of Defense to get these savings. And the name that kept coming up was Kenny Klepper. Kenny has done this in a Fortune 50 company. He understands that the DoD is not a business, it is government, and there's not easy efficiency opportunities. So with that, we got Kenny to lead this study. This study succeeded in this goal and highlighted an inefficiency that, if remedied, could generate significant cost savings to the department. This cost savings could then be transferred to other priorities like improving readiness, modernizing our defense, and creating jobs. The study was presented to the full DBB at public hearing January 25th and won a unanimous approval for its findings and recommendations. The General Accountability Office also reviewed the study and found the methodologies and analysis adequately confirm its conclusions. After completion of the study, along with other members of the DBB, we're ready to move forward to assist the DoD in reviewing the study's findings and recommendations. I believe that DBB efficiency study represents a quality analysis of costs and inefficiencies at DoD, and it's my hope that it will be useful to the agency's efforts to streamline. It was an honor to lead the DBB during the creation of the study, and I'm proud of the work achieved in support of strong national defense. Thank you for your time, and I'm pleased to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you. Mr. Klepper, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning.
If you can move that microphone up close, just straighten it out. There you go. Thank you. There you go. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Chaffetz and Minority Ranking Member Cummings. It's a pleasure to be here. I've served as an advisor on the CNO's executive panel for 5 CNOs, and this is a first for me for over a decade. So I am happy to be here to tell the story of the work that we've done. The effort that we embarked on for the Defense Business Study is something I took very, very seriously. Just briefly, a little of my background. I spent 40 years with the trade craft of organizational modernization and change. I spent about 20 years in chemical plant refinery operations out in Texas. And then I spent the second 20 years in healthcare. And I chose in my written remarks that I submitted to the panel an example that I think has a lot of stark parallels. Even though, as Bobby said, that I understand that the Defense Department is not a business, there are some very strong parallels. I was asked to come in and help do a turnaround for a company in New York called Empire Blue Cross Blue Shield. It was financially insolvent at the time, not enough reserves to pay for claims, the largest health plan in the Northeast of the United States. And one of the things we did as part of the recovery of that company was understand that we had no money, and the only way that we could, and we had an obsolete legacy infrastructure running it, and we were losing millions of members a year. The company was in a death spiral. Since we didn't have cash to spend, the only way we could fund the things that urgently needed to be addressed to improve the performance of the business was to self-fund those things through productivity. So we put in place an opportunity to take productivity savings as a way to generate the money to invest in the platforms and the automation and the improvements to recover the company, which we did, and we were doing really well. And then on September 11th, we were the second largest tenant in the World Trade Center. And through all the things that we did to improve speed, agility, optimize our operations for the private sector, to improve our service to our members and the physicians, we never recognized the inherent ability that it gave us to survive a devastating disaster for our facility. We had over 2,000 people in the building at the time, and with great pride I can tell you, if we can separate the human tragedy for just a moment, we lost 11 people that day, that when the tower collapsed, we were able to maintain the operation of the business. We lost 3 call centers, 2 large server farms. They all failed over to other operations, and the company continued to operate. The Kennedy Business School did a case study that we included in my written remarks. And the reason I bring that up is when you look at the state of the operation of DoD, the obsolescence of the legacy infrastructure is not just a bad cost situation and not just creating bad service. I think it increases the vulnerability of the operation to other threats, whether it is a kinetic attack, an EMP attack, cyber attacks. It is almost impossible to harden those type of legacy cores. So part of what I hope that we can achieve through the modernization of these assets is not just improve the cost basis and not just improve the service, but to also harden and provide a much more resilient infrastructure for the Department of Defense. The last thing I would mention is of the $125 billion savings. You know, we did something that had never been done before, and I give great credit to the Deputy Secretary, Bob Work, is whenever I talked to him that the one thing that we had to have to really start was we had to have transparency of where the money was, where the cash flows were. Now, he did something I think has never been done before. He sponsored presentations by Bobby and myself to the DEXCOM, the Defense Executive Committee. He described the process evaluation that we wanted to do and that we advised him to do. And to his credit, he got approval from all the civilian leadership to let us get the money. And we brought in, I actually asked to have McKinsey brought in because I've done this study before with them and they did a great job for me. We had over 100 people pulling data out of these systems. And people before then had said the data's not there, the data's no good, antibodies will get you. And what we found was the data was there, and the data was not perfect, and believe me, the study's not perfect, but I believe that the savings that we identified are there with a high degree of certainty. So I think the debate and the big question for us is, and I think it was stated by Mr. Tillotson and Mr. Rutherford, is the money's there. It's can we get the institution out of the way to help us do the things that can obviously help us improve the operation of the business. And that's the purpose of us being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Corbett, now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Chaffetz, Ranking Member Cummings, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I think this hearing comes at a very critical time. As Ranking Member Cummings mentioned, the President Trump wants to add $54 billion to the fiscal year 18 budget. It's also important to keep in mind that they're proposing to add $30 billion to the fiscal 17 budget, and then the Congress last year added $23 billion in the National Defense Authorization Act. So we're talking about adding $100 billion to the defense budget compared to what we thought about a year ago. It's also important to keep in mind, has been very well documented, and even people in the Pentagon admit that the overseas contingency budget or the warfighting budget, about half of it is used to fund items from the enduring items or from the base budget, and then the Pentagon has gotten relief for the last 5 years from the budget cap. So I want to put that into perspective. Now, in terms of what the Defense Business Board recommended, let me give you some examples from my own career that I think buttress the points that they made. Basically, I've been working on these issues ever since I was in the service in the 60s, at AEI in the 70s, working with former Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, who I think was probably the most effective secretary we've ever had. The privilege I had of serving for 5 years in the Reagan administration, administering about 70% of the defense budget, and then continuing to focus on these areas at Brookings, the Council on Foreign Relations, and now the Center for American Progress. When I was Assistant Secretary of Defense, my title was Manpower, Installations, and Logistics. Right now, you do not have anybody in that position. They have taken the manpower or personnel part of it, elevated to an undersecretary, even though he or she does not have responsibility for installations and logistics. During most of the Cold War, we had one assistant secretary serving in the policy area. It was called the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs. Now you have 7 confirmable positions in the policy area. All of these men and women have their own staffs. When I was working in government, the Congress took the lead in proposing the Goldwater-Nichols Reform Act, which was really very, very critical to get the department to really be unified for the first time. All of my colleagues fought it because they felt that it was saying that they were not doing their job. I thought, having based on my own research and testifying on it, I supported it. What we did is we empowered the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Joint Staff, and so they increased their staffs. The service chiefs did not decrease their staffs, and so what you ended up with was an increase in the staff. Similarly, when we set up new commands like the Africa Command and the Central Command, you did not decrease the staffs of the commands that used to have responsibilities for those areas. And then finally, And this is very, very critical, and in the Bob Woodward article, they quote former Secretary of the Navy Ray Mabus talking about the fact that he says 20% of the budget goes to overhead in agencies, and he mentioned the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Defense Logistics Agency. Well, the fact of the matter is, when those agencies were created, the idea was that the services would transfer those functions to a unified organization, and they would cut their own staffs. They didn't. And I mentioned in my testimony when I did my dissertation and wrote my book on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when I asked a former Chief of Naval Operations, how did you handle this? He said, we never cut the size of our own logistics organizations or in intelligence. Let me conclude with this point. I can assure you that if you add the additional funds that have been proposed by President Trump, you will ensure that those reforms do not get made. The best way to ensure that it happens is don't give them any more money. Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimony. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Tillotson, let's go back to this study. You originally awarded the study to name the company again?
Ryan Consulting.
Do you happen to know R. Keith Harding, the president, I believe?
I do not know.
If I have the right website, I might.
You may, but I'll be honest with you, no, I do not know.
And how much money was paid to Ryan Consulting?
For the two elements of the contract that were executed during the DBB study, about $2.9 million. There was a third deliverable that was not incorporated in the DBB study, and that was another, I think it was $3 million. So overall, about $6.
$6 million.
Yes, sir.
And how much of the work did they actually do?
I can't tell you. I do know that the McKinsey team the lead for the study was from McKinsey, and I don't know what the actual work split is.
Mr. Rutherford, how much were you paid to do this study?
$8 million.
So you got $8 million, but you let out this contract for $6 million. How does that work?
I don't know. That's not how the numbers.
Where's the other $2 million come from?
I was just referring back to when we looked at our contracts for the totality of the full contract. I thought it was $8 million.
Excuse me, let me correct myself. I think it's closer to 9 is what we actually wound up with. Sorry, it was an additional 6. That's why I'm remembering a 6.
So an additional 6.
Yes, sir. Sorry.
6 plus the
my bad.
2.6.
6 plus 2.9, so it's about 9. That sounds about right.
So 8.9 or $9 million, and McKinsey gets $2 million or $6 million, or $8 million. And we don't know what percentage of the work Ryan did.
I do not know what percentage of the work Ryan.
Is that something you can figure out and get back to this committee?
I can certainly go ask. I'll have to ask Ryan. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. How in the world did you select Ryan Consulting? With all due respect, I'm sure they're nice people. If I have the right website, they got 3 senior people. Their head of human resources has a grand total of 6 years, and I'm sure that Tiffany Hollis, if I have the right website, is a very nice person.
I will get back to you with the answer.
But how do they get such a contract? I mean, the Pentagon, we're talking about $600 billion or something in annual expenditures, and I'm rounding by big numbers here, but I mean, McKinsey and Company is a huge, massive company with a great reputation. And I really am curious, because I think we're starting to see where a lot of waste starts to go, right? What did we get for the $900,000 or $1 million that Ryan kept, if the math you gave me already was working?
Sure.
You give them 9, they give McKinsey 8. What'd we get for that other $1 million?
I will get back to you and let you know how much work they put in.
Yeah, that's what I worry about. Even just doing a study, we can't figure out what we cost and what it didn't cost and who got paid and who did the work. And we give a contract to somebody, with all due respect. Again, I'd love to look at their background, and we will, but how in the world did they even get the contract to starting with? Sure. Because you're going to need the expertise and the depth and the knowledge of a McKinsey to actually get it done. So if you could let us know.
Sure.
I also want to know specifically from the time you decided to do this study to the time you actually let out the contract and actually McKinsey started working on it, because that's part of the problem. Whether you're buying an F-35 or whether you're buying a study, this is, again, this is the problem in the bureaucracy of the Pentagon. Let me go to you, Mr. Stein. I only have a minute left here. What's your biggest takeaway from all this? What's your, you got a lot of expertise. What's your biggest takeaway? And maybe add to that what your biggest frustration is.
The biggest takeaway is that the focus has got to be on the warfighter, and the process has got to be a partnership between Congress and DoD. And I think we're all in this together, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And this is critical. The $20 trillion that one of the retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs says is we got a $20 trillion.
Yeah, but specific to this study, come on, we spent all this money, you've looked at this, you were the chairman, then you're former chairman. What's working, what's not working?
Well, the key thing that works is you got to have heart surgeons, as I said, to help the DoD. There are only certain people that can do this type of work, and you need their help. And I will say that McKinsey did a great job, and I will say that there was a lot of work around both uniform and non-uniform people in the DoD that did great work. But you need people like Kenny Klepper. If not Kenny Klepper, you need people that understand this process to make change. And once you figure out what those changes are, you got to coordinate between Congress and DoD, and you got to change culture. And culture is tough to change.
Thank you. Now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much.
Would the ranking member just yield for 1 second before he starts?
Of course.
I thank my friend, and not to count against his time, I just want to welcome a lot of my constituents from Herndon, Virginia, who are here watching a hearing, and we're delighted to have them here today.
We welcome you all for being here, and you're very sharply dressed. Let the record reflect how sharply dressed, well, at least row 4 is. So thank you. We appreciate your attendance. We now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much. Let me tell Mr. Stein, you all volunteer for this, right?
Yes, sir.
Oh, that's what I thought. How confident are you about the potential savings? You know, you were the chairman of the Defense Business Board when the study was conducted. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I know how dedicated you are to these kind of causes. But I mean, you know, it just seems like we talk about this all the time, but it seems like we never get a hold of it. In other words, we talk about it, savings, we talk about overspending, but it seems as if we can never, you know, we get a lot of good recommendations, but we never get there. You follow me? So first of all, I guess you feel pretty comfortable that the potential savings are there.
I absolutely feel that the savings are there, number one. Number two, when we looked at this, our focus was how do we do this without firing people? You know, you have almost 30% of the workforce retiring in the next 5 years, which, you know, this was 2 years back. You have 1% of the contracts is 65% is the spend. You got 1,500 data centers in today's world of the cloud. And the big thing, Congressman, is everybody says that, you know, we are, you know, the number's too low or the number's too high, but nobody sat in the room with us and with Kenny. And this is a process that I hope comes out of this, is people sit in the room and sit down with Kenny and go through the numbers, and we have to update the numbers, but the numbers don't lie. And what we got to do is adults sitting around, because this is for our kids and grandkids to get this right. There are not many times that we will have to get this thing right. And what I was saying is we do have $20 trillion of debt, and if interest rates go up 3 points, that wipes out the defense budget. So I'm saying is what I would love to come out of this is we've got very bright people in Congress, in DoD, and Kenny spent a year talking about this was an unpaid job. He spent a year on this. And I think if we can work towards what he has done, his process, And seeing how we take advantage of that process, I think this country will be better off.
No, I got that. Mr. Klepp, well, let me go back. You know, we've had all of these, I'm going to come to you in 1 second, Mr. Klepper, and you may want to answer this too. We've had all these instances, I haven't heard about any recently, where we're paying like $500 for a trash can. And I mean, is that kind of waste and fraud? I see you laughing, Mr. Korb. I mean, are we still doing that?
When I was in government, I had to handle the $500 toilet seat. I had to deal with that before
That must have
Congress.
been a hell of a toilet seat. Good. $500, you said?
Yes, that was a big issue, and Senator Grassley and I were able to work together to stop that type of stuff.
Is that a large part of the problem, Mr. Klepper, you think? In other words, you got a system that's just, it's almost on automatic. Let me finish. Then you got some old boys in there too. Hello. And they've been used to getting these contracts. And everybody wants folks to make a profit. But we don't want to be ripped off either. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, do you see a lot of waste? I mean, what are you seeing? And, you know, anybody else on the panel that might be able to answer that?
So we focused on, in the study, as far as the analysis, trying to find the areas where we thought there was the biggest opportunity to get savings quicker. So you don't see big IT re-engineering kind of things or multi-year projects. There's lots of savings through automation that you could have there. So we focused really on 2 areas: contract optimization and restructuring, and an early retirement opportunity to avoid having to fire people. Big numbers on both sides. 2 key areas that we saw in the contracting piece, and it is there, the data is there, it's inescapable, is one is, and I think you heard some conversation, is there's a lot of tiered contracts. So somebody has a contract, and the only way you can get on the contract is you have to be a sub, and maybe a sub of a sub, and a sub. So what happens is, in the subs, it's like a credit card transaction fee. So when you get down to the bottom, what did you actually pay for the service by the time it went through this bureaucracy? Forgetting even the cost of the bureaucracy and all the people that worked all of those contracts.
That's what the chairman, that's what you were going to, right? Yeah.
I mean, it's rampant, and it's massive. And so when we looked at that, we went in specifically looking at those things because you can get at that, not necessarily even reducing contractor services, looking at what you end up paying and going out and rebidding large-scale bids for like-type services and getting a much, much bigger rate, better rate at the same kind of services. So that was one of the key deliverables in the contract optimization component.
I see my time is up. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stein, you were chairman of the DBB when the Department of Defense commissioned you guys to do the study. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And the goal was to look at how to make back office operations more efficient, save money. That was the objective of the study.
Yes, sir.
And as I understand, I just want to walk through the basics here. And as I understand it, we felt like you needed some help on a study this size. So you worked with McKinsey. They did a lot of the work to come up with the findings. Is that right?
No. The way it worked is I asked Kenny to lead this effort.
Okay. So the DBB led the effort.
The
This is your
DBB
study.
led the effort.
McKinsey helped.
McKinsey helped. Yes.
Okay.
But
And the conclusions were that you could save $125 billion in taxpayer dollars over 5 years at the Department of Defense. Is that accurate?
yes, sir.
And that savings meant that you could save money in back office operations. That money could then go to upgraded weapon systems and to our troops in the field.
Yes.
Great objective. I mean, that's exactly what we want. I think we all want to have happen. Now, so you get this study. It says you can save $125 billion over 5 years and put the money in troops and better weapon systems. All sounds good. My guess is this wasn't the first study that the DBB had authorized and commissioned to do. You probably do studies all the time and have reports. Is that accurate? This wasn't your first study?
This was not our first study.
So you do this all the time,
Yes.
right? So when all these other studies, you commission a study, you work with some outside group, maybe or maybe not. You get back the report. What typically happens with the report and all those other studies? What do you do with the report?
They're put on the website and they're distributed, bounded, and
The DoD website,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And are they typically printed out, lots of copies, published, wide dissemination? Does that all happen?
Yes, sir.
Every other time you've done a study and got the conclusions, that's the normal course of business?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, that sort of raises the obvious question. Did that happen with this report?
I think it was taken off the website.
So, all the other times you use taxpayer dollars, you do a study, find out something important for taxpayers and potentially savings, there's a normal way that information is presented to the public. DoD puts it on their website. They take that report, they print it, they make several copies, i.e. it's published, and it gets wide dissemination so we can learn the valuable information that we spend a lot of taxpayer dollars to get.
Yes, sir.
Okay, in this case, was the report put on the website?
It was put on the website and taken down.
Oh, so it didn't stay on the website. Okay.
After I left the DBD.
And that's not the normal course of business, right?
No, sir.
Okay. Was it printed?
I think there are people told not to print the report.
Okay, so it wasn't printed. Now, Mr. Tillotson looks like he's disagreeing based on his hand motion over there.
There's your printed report.
Okay. Was it widely disseminated, Mr. Stein?
McKinney, you can talk to that.
Mr. Klepper?
Well, I don't know if it was widely disseminated. I know after I left the board, I called back in and asked if I could get a printed copy, and they told me that they were told not to print it.
Not to print.
That's the first printed copy I've ever seen.
Mr. Tillotson, is that the only printed copy, or were there lots of copies?
There are lots of copies.
Really?
Yes, and they were distributed at the time.
Why does the guy who chaired the DBB at the time the report was commissioned, and at the time that the report was actually completed, say that that wasn't widely disseminated, wasn't printed, and was taken off the website?
So I have no idea why he wasn't given a copy.
Why did the
of the
Washington
report.
Post report what Mr. Stein seems to be, Mr. Klepper seemed to be saying here today, and not what you're saying?
Because they also believe, as Mr. Stein believes, that it was taken off the website. It was not. To be accurate, it was moved from one location to another location. It was never taken off the website.
Was it moved from a high-profile location to a somewhat less high-profile location?
It was moved to the meeting minutes location, which is publicly available. It's been downloaded 2,800 times since January of 2015.
Mr. Stein, is that consistent with how things are normally done with the other reports, the many other reports you've commissioned?
This is the best of my knowledge. I have not checked. Kenny, do you have any comment there?
Well, let's just assume you guys assume that what you're saying is exactly right. Give me, because I got just a few seconds here, tell me why. Why the difference? Why was this report treated different? Mr. Stein, why would it be treated different?
I don't understand it.
Maybe it was the magnitude of the findings? Could that be? Seems logical to me. Let me just, Mr. Chairman, if I could just read one. We have an email from Deputy Secretary of Defense, Mr. Work, that he sent to the Secretary of the Navy, Mr. Mabus, and he says this. He criticizes a speech that Mr. Mabus made where he referred to the very report we're talking about right here, and he said, there were problems with your speech, and let me just quote, Senator McCain believes we can take a 30% reduction in management headquarters. He says to Mr. Mabus, your comments could easily be used by him and his staff as justification for the size of the cuts referenced in the report. So maybe the reason it was treated different is because some folks at DoD didn't actually want this out there, this $8 million study that shows $125 billion in savings over 5 years. Could that be a logical explanation why it was treated different, Mr. Stein?
I have no idea. I really don't. I left the DBB, and after I left DBB, I had no responsibility on what happened to the report. All I know is if I was still chairman of the DBB, that report would have been
treated like it normally would, like all the reports are treated, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the panel. Mr. Tillotson, it's your contention in response to Mr. Jordan's questioning that there was no attempt to downplay or hide or suppress the results of this study. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressman.
How many copies of the report were in fact printed?
I can't tell you, but I will find out and let you know. I know I've been dropping them off every place I've gone since the Washington Post article came out because people have been asking. So we have a stack of them. They've been available throughout the period.
So have copies been made available to the current members of the DBB?
Yes.
You have one, Chairman Byer?
Yes, sir, I do.
So were copies made available to former members and the former chairman of the DBB, such as Mr. Stein?
So this is the first I've heard that anybody had not been given a copy when it was requested, so I can't answer.
So maybe we can accomplish something here today. Would you
We can certainly give
would you
copies to
promise
anybody.
under oath, Mr. Tillotson, to make sure Mr. Stein and company have copies of the report?
Yes, Mr. Congressman.
I thank you so much. Mr. Tillotson, in your testimony, you identify potentially $1.9 billion in savings under the IT rubric. Mr. Rutherford, I believe the comparable number in your report, McKinsey's report, is 5 to 9 billion. Is that correct?
I believe so, sir.
So, Mr. Tillotson, why the discrepancy? Why are you so low and McKinsey so high? And as you may know, this committee is pretty interested in the IT management and procurement issue, and DoD is the one agency that's been, from our point of view, a reluctant partner in compliance with FTARA, also known as ISA Connolly.
And the answer to your question, Mr. Congressman, is I don't disagree with the numbers from McKinsey. I also don't disagree with the DBB report that suggests there are many more billions to find. What we have provided in the response to date is what we have actually put in place to date, as opposed to other activities that we need to do. So we put $1.9 billion worth of initial work in the 17 budget. In the 18 budget, we added another $250 million, which I would acknowledge, by the way, to this committee is not anywhere close to what's possible. But there was a deliberate decision made as we constructed our discussions in 18 to allow headroom for a new administration to walk in and make decisions.
All right, fair enough.
I think there's ample more dollars to be saved in the IT space alone that would even actually come up close to the total number McKinsey is suggesting we could achieve. I think we could achieve those numbers, which is kind of more in line with the DBB numbers.
Let me ask this. I would ask that you submit to the committee that potential plan. We would be very interested to see a little fleshed out plan in terms of what are the savings we think we could strive for, not for the purpose of, making you, face the Inquisition, but for the point of view, we want to get better compliance for FTARA across the federal government. You're the biggest.
I understand, Mr. Congressman.
Okay.
We agree with you.
Terrific. Mr. Korb, I mentioned to you before the hearing, but for the average citizen, looking at a relatively indisputable number of $125 billion over 5 years, maybe at least, but all right, that is wasted in Pentagon spending or grossly inefficient. Why in the world would we want to add $54 billion to the Pentagon's budget this year when we haven't addressed the critical issue of efficiency? Why would we want to throw more, good money after bad? If this were a civilian agency, I know my friends on the other side of the aisle would be all over it.
I agree with you, Congressman. In fact, my feeling is if you give them the extra money, and as I mentioned in my testimony, it's not just the 54. They want to add 30 to the 17 budget in addition to the 28 that the Congress has added in the 17 NDAA. They won't do it. If you really want them to do this and to make a full-faith effort to implement these recommendations, you cannot give them more money, because if you do, there'll be no incentive to do it. And I think that's really the key issue. I mentioned in my testimony about my work with former Secretary Laird. If you go back and you take a look at the Nixon administration, when the defense budget was cut substantially, in today's dollars, it was like $350 billion. Look at the reforms they made under the leadership of David Packard. That's the point I'm trying to make, and I couldn't agree with you more.
And I would just to add, because my time is up, but I mean, it isn't this, there is a huge opportunity cost too. So in addition to throwing good money after bad potentially, I'm talking about by leaving waste unaddressed, this waste, we're also taking away from civilian domestic investments that are also critical. So it's a double cost when we do this if we don't address this issue. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for having the hearing today. I think it's a very important one, and I appreciate very much all of our witnesses being here.
I thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Florida, the chairman of our subcommittee on national security, Mr. DeSantis of Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Tillotson, when the results of the study indicating these potential savings were revealed, what was your reaction?
My reaction was that the potential for the savings was certainly there, but that the timetable was not going to be executable in a federal government setting. And I had long conversations with Mr. Klepper at the time, recognizing that the basis of his recommendation was largely a corporate model. He agreed. And part of that issue is because we have an interaction in the process that occurs both within the executive side of the federal government and then a subsequent interaction that occurs with Congress in decisions of significant magnitude that involve changing organizations and structures.
I understand that. But you, at bottom, though, you did welcome the opportunity to try to save money and make the operations better.
Unequivocally, I think the study was well done. I think the work done by McKinsey was significant. In fact, we followed on from the McKinsey work to try and put better cost repetition in place so that we can get a better handle on these issues. So everything that was done in the study has actually now allowed us to form the basis of how we approach the problem going forward.
Your recollection, who briefed the Deputy Secretary on the results of the study?
It was Mr. Klepper and Mr. Stein.
Okay. Were you there when,
Yes.
When he was there? What was his reaction?
His reaction was also positive.
It was a positive?
Yes, sir.
Then why did he ultimately dismiss the findings?
He did not. In fact, the reference that was made to the email exchange in which he allegedly referenced or dismissed the findings, Secretary Work, was actually addressing the fact that Secretary Mabus was raising the issue in public rather than bringing it forward as an internal conversation. And in the same email, I quote from Secretary Work to Secretary Mabus, "There is absolutely nothing wrong with your call for the Department to get more efficient. It is timely and on point. I'd simply request that you continue to push internally to get the Department more efficient and focus your public comments on the Department of the Navy."
And I did see that, and I appreciate that. So let me ask, as the Washington Post article claims that Deputy Secretary Work suppressed the DBB study from wider dissemination and tried to keep it held. Now, you've disputed that Washington Post story. Is it your testimony that this report received the fullest possible dissemination within the Department?
The report was discussed within the Department at the highest levels. It was discussed with all the senior leaders of the Department at the time. I will tell you, I think there were...
You say it was widely disseminated.
Yes,
sir. Is that your testimony?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Was this study shown to the Secretary of Defense?
Yes, I believe it was at the DEXCOM meeting. Was discussed at the DEXCOM with the Secretary of Defense at the time.
Okay. And what was the reaction from the SecDef?
I think he was positive at the time.
Okay. Let me ask Mr. Baer, have you read the study?
What I have read of the slides, I have not read this. It was never formalized into a completed study report.
Now, was there, since you've become chairman, has there been a discussion about limiting the distribution within DoD? Have you been privy to, obviously you read the Washington Post article, I'm sure, when that came out.
Yes, absolutely not. It's never been limited. It's been available on the website from the moment it was briefed to the board and the public in January.
You don't have a role, your testimony would be you have no role in limiting it in any way. Is that correct?
I didn't limit it in any way.
Okay. And And you didn't have any discussions with anybody at DoD about limiting the report, the dissemination?
Having been on the Defense Business Board for a decade, perhaps a little context here, is that the board is tasked by terms of reference to do a particular piece of work. In this case, this effort. When that effort is completed, it's briefed to the public, and the chairman and the members of the committee then brief the other senior leadership in the department, at which point the board moves on to other work. From the time in which this effort was completed, the effort at hand, the board has done 9 other pieces of work in the normal progression of things.
So why, I mean, what is your response to the questions that were asked? You have some of these things that are publicly available, more prominent. This one is I would say, in a little bit harder to find location. Well, why is that?
Well, very simply, there's 3 places on the Defense Business Board website where previous work is displayed. When you dial onto the website to beginning, there's a banner of work that flies by. That's always the most current work. For a while, this effort was there, but it was—
How long, do you know?
I don't. I'd have to go back.
Was it still on when you took over as
When I took
chairman?
over, it was on, but it was replaced by the next piece of work, fostering an innovative culture through corporate engagement and partnership. It was always available on the minutes of that board meeting in January of 2015. It was erroneously listed as a report because, with the greatest respect, this is what a report looks like. It has all the context and the verbiage associated with the briefing and the deliberation of the board. What was on the board site at that time was this, which is now hardbound. That's a collection of slides. There's no narrative, no explanation, no discussion. And further, every single page of this thing says on it, the full DB report will later contain detailed texts which will reflect the totality of the points discussed and modifications. Those were never delivered, and it was never put into final form. So that's why it stayed on the minutes section of the meeting and not a report. It was never a report. It's a collection of slides.
Okay, well, my time's up. I think there'll probably be some follow-up to that for some of our other members.
Yeah, with the committee's indulgence here, Mr. Rutherford, was there ever a final report written?
From the DBB's report?
From the work you did you ever write a final report?
Yeah, so our deliverables from the final report when we did in May were delivered to the DCMO. That was the work we did. The DBB report leveraged our baseline. We continued on after 2015.
So the taxpayers paid you $8 million. Did you write a final report?
We delivered a number of deliverables, both the baseline tools for them to leverage that going forward to actually measure the effectiveness. We gave them actually the breakdown of where the cost savings would be, where they should actually go
I asked a
forward
pretty
in the
simple
metrics.
question. Is there a final report out there?
There's a set of deliverables that we gave based on our contract.
Go ahead.
Did you complete the contract?
Yes, sir, we did.
Okay, and how do you define completion of the contract? How is that defined?
So the contract asks for a number of deliverables. Number one was a baseline assessment of all of the 6 comprehensive support functions to the business board. So what we did is we provided a view of all of the numbers for the DCMO for them to measure on a go-forward basis where is the spend across these 6 areas. In addition to that, we gave them a set of efficiency metrics that they can use going forward to measure this baseline as they go forward. Thirdly, we provided them a number of things when it came to where the cost savings would be.
If I may offer a point of clarity, here, Mr. Rutherford is speaking accurately. The contract that was let was between the DCMO office and Ryan/McKinsey to deliver a series of information products, which includes a database, which included a number of documents. Those documents were there. They were not on contract. They were not on contract to write a DBB report. The DBB report, as Mr. Stein has indicated, is the responsibility of the Defense Business Board, and we delivered information from the government, that we generated through McKinsey to the Defense Business Board for them to use as the basis of evaluation. So when you ask if Mr. Chairman, respectfully, if you ask if they delivered a DBB report, the answer is no, they did not, but it was not their job to do so. Did they deliver the things we requested in the contract? Unequivocally, yes. I have those documents. Those are separate
I just got
documents.
one more question. Mr. Klepper, you agree with this report slide thing? See, I'm confused. I mean, it's just.
I can offer some.
Yeah, and offer some clarity, because I'm used to, a contract says you do certain things for a certain amount of money, and you deliver them, period. So is this something that's open-ended, by the way? Go ahead.
No, sir. There were specific CLIN deliverables. We got those deliverables. Okay. Those were delivered.
And then
some of this is new information to me. I can tell you about the report. The final report was being written. It was almost completed. I was waiting for it, and then I had made a decision to leave. And they were very close, because I was going to proofread, go ahead and do a proofread. So we were very close. They were working on it. So then I called back and I said, it was a few weeks later, I said, have you finished your report? And I took it. And the officer that was working it said they were told to stand down. So never got it. Now, this document that David's got, that's the first time I've seen it. So I can't answer what happened after that.
So I think it's safe to say that this thing you were waving around, Mr. Tillotson, this is not the report, is it?
That is all that I have as a report.
Yeah, it's not a report. It's a slide deck. In fact, it refers to a report that's forthcoming that never did get produced. And we spent $9 million and never did get a report. Is that accurate?
No, that's not accurate. So
well, where's the report? Where is the report?
So with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, again, the contract wasn't to deliver a DBB report. There is no.
You can keep going in circles. We paid $9 million to taxpayers to get a report. You started flailing around saying, here it is, it's printed. This is a slide deck. It's not a report.
With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, the contract specified.
Don't give me your. Did you report? Did they develop and produce and publish and put on the internet a report? Yes or no?
McKinsey did not put a report on the internet, nor were they.
This is why we're having this hearing, and this is why you are overseeing a department that is in chaos.
Nor were they contracted to do so. With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, they were not.
We'll now recognize Ms. Watson Coleman of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today. The topic of waste within the Department of Defense is vitally important, and it deserves our utmost consideration, especially considering that President Trump's budget proposes stripping other parts of the federal budget to fund the Defense Department by an additional $52 billion. Dr. Korb, during your January appearance before the Senate Armed Services Committee, you began your written remarks by noting that in the defense budget, and I quote, dollars are policy. Stripping $52 billion from other federal programs speaks loudly about policy priorities, does it not?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. This committee has a duty to ensure that we are effective stewards of the taxpayer dollars, and that also includes ensuring the effectiveness of the programs that Congress funds. Mr. Klepper, it sounds like one of the findings of your study was that the Defense Department has significant inefficiency and waste in its business processes. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Korb, do you agree that the Defense Department could implement changes that would result in billions of dollars of efficiency savings?
Yes, it is, and I testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and one of my colleagues here, Mr. Tillotson, mentioned a report that I just did last week on this.
Thank you. Instead of looking for efficiency savings at the Defense Department, President Trump's so-called skinny budget released last week slashes critical domestic programs to provide more than $50 billion in additional funding to the Defense Department. Despite the President's claim that this budget puts America first, and I put that in quotes, based on recent reporting, the budget would actually hurt some vulnerable communities, such as low-income and elderly Americans. For instance, the budget would eliminate funding for the Appalachian Regional Commission, a program in 13 states that has since 1965 provided funding to promote economic growth. Most recently, it has helped retrain coal miners who have lost their jobs. Dr. Korb, would you agree that it is important for the federal government to spend its dollars wisely?
I certainly would.
And one way to do that is to measure program effectiveness. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
The Appalachian Regional Commission cites a dramatic decline in poverty rates in Appalachia from 30% to under 17% between 1960 and 2017, a substantial reduction in the number of high poverty counties from 295 to 84 during that same period. Dr. Korb, assuming those numbers are correct, that sounds like the program has been working for America, does it not?
It certainly does.
The President's proposed budget would also eliminate funding for the low-income home energy assistance program, which helps low-income people pay for heat in the winter. It would also cut funding for the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, which helps fund after-school programs serving more than 1.6 million children nationwide, and reducing Meals on Wheels, where millions of meals have been delivered to the vulnerable and the elderly. Mr. Chairman, while I agree that we should provide the warfighter with everything that he or she needs, I do not believe that should come at the expense of critical domestic programs that serve our nation's most vulnerable. I agree that dollars are indeed policy, so some of these dollars should be going to the neediest of Americans. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlewoman. We'll now recognize Mr. Issa of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up a little bit where the chairman left off. No surprise. Yes, sir, it's you. You said there wasn't contracted for a report. Who determines when you put the word report onto a PowerPoint stack? I know that terms are loose, but this thing purports to be a report in hard printing, right?
Yes, yes.
But it's not a report.
It is the report, to the extent that one exists, for this study by the Defense Business Board, and the answer as to who owns that is the Defense Business Board owns that product, and we provide support, administrative support to the board when they do that. The information from McKinsey was government information that we would provide to the Defense Business Board, as we would to a Defense Science Board or anybody else.
Okay, well, let me go to the chairman for a second. Look, this is a new era, and I think we've got to ask some tough questions. And I support this money being used. If I calculate it roughly right as an old Army guy, those 50 brigades would be over 100,000 men we'd be able to add in end strength. That's basically a full rotation, a whole group of people that don't have to redeploy in a given year if we had that many more in the Army. So this is the difference between Army people finding themselves coming and going back and forth to combat when you look at 50 brigades. I didn't focus on the other two branches. I'm not as familiar with them. So, Chairman, let me ask a couple of questions. One of them was, it was stated that they lost focus. Mr. Tillotson, I think, said that. How do you lose interest in $125 billion once you identify that number?
Which of us do you want to answer that question?
I'm sorry, Chairman Beyer, I thought you were the, I'm sorry, I'm two chairmen, but only one has the title underneath there. But I'll take both of you. How do you lose interest once you recognize, even if it's not in a report, but a stack of PowerPoint, how is it you lose interest in saving $125 billion? Chairman Beyer, I'd like you first.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, Mr. Issa, we don't lose interest in saving money. The board was formed 15 years ago. It's done far more than 100 pieces of work, all of which, the great sweep of that work is about how the department can do things more efficiently.
Okay, let me go through a question then, because obviously this is a little bit like, it's an economic 9/11, if you will. Yeah. On 9/11, we didn't connect the dots, so the bad guys bombed our country with our own aircraft. So let's talk about $125 billion. Did you connect the dots between you and the appropriators or any other members of Congress so we would know there's $125 billion in savings in your report, in your non-report, that we could have had?
That would have been done under the previous chairman, who served for an additional 90 days after that effort was voted out of the full
No, the question is, did anyone, not You're saying you don't know?
Well, there is, I prefer to defer that to Chairman Stein at that time, who
Chairman
led
Stein,
those
did
briefs.
you report to members of Congress who would have been able to reprogram $125 billion if they took advantage of these savings?
Well, first of all, I want, there's and this is the first time I've heard this, the difference between slides and a report, but we fully approved a report. I left after 90 days, and we started to move out to talk to Congress, and then we were stopped.
Okay, who stopped you? Who stopped you from telling Congress there were 100,000 men that could be deployed with this money?
The best I can, and remember, these numbers are compounding. So if you save $1 billion this year, it'll be $2 billion this.
You mean eventually $1 billion here, $1 billion there, it adds up to real money?
Adds up
That's
to
still
real
true?
money. This is real money. The thing I want to make sure of, first of all, I will say that, and I want to make this clear, that this was the first ever that a labor cost, the work that McKinsey did was important. It's the first time it was ever done. So I just want to make sure that is said. The second thing is we had full approval and a public hearing on this report. And Ash Carter, we were told that.
But I asked you who stopped it.
We don't know. It was
okay.
Just
well,
stopped.
I
was asked.
Let me ask you a more than rhetorical question because I'm going to run out of time. I'm sorry, Chairman. How do we, on this side of the dais, ensure that never again are there tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in savings that the American people are denied because some unknown person in the Department of Defense puts a kibosh on it for whatever reason and Congress doesn't find out about it? How do we stop that from happening? What law do we have to pass to guarantee the transparency to that gentleman so that or to the appropriators or to whoever in Congress so that, in fact, the American people never get a raw deal after good money has been spent to study something that could save the American people or at least save American lives by plussing up our military?
So I'll say two things. Look, when I left, Mr. Baer took over as chairman, and he didn't want to continue this. Secretary Carter did not want to continue this. So let me say the second thing here is that we have, and you're a businessman, Congressman, having a great plan is one thing. Having people that can implement it is another. You have one of the great people here that spent a year working on this. And you had McKinsey who spent a year, and the people Scott had involved were as good as you can get. What I like to do is get people in the same room with Kenny Klepper, whoever that might be, and that's the one thing that frustrated me, is not the same people were sitting in a room and they disagree or agree, but we're talking about very important things, and nobody will get in the same room. And I'm saying that Dave Tillotson is as good a person as you can find. Bob Work is as good a person as you can find. And the antibodies got us. And the antibodies is going to kill this country if we don't stop. And we got to change culture, and we got to make things to happen.
Mr. Chairman, I'd only ask that you and the ranking member and all of us commit ourselves to make sure that we never again allow the absence of this body knowing that there's an opportunity on a study like this and never again allow it to be buried. Certainly this is an example where I wish an IG had brought it to you, Chairman and Ranking Member Cummings, but since they didn't, I look forward to working with you on mandating that in the future so it can't happen again.
Thank you. And Mr. Stein, just to clarify with questioning from Mr. Issa, was there a final report that you had approved that did not get published?
The best I know, and this is processed now, and I want to make sure, we approved in a public hearing this report. It was fully vetted, fully rated. Now, these guys are saying something different. I'm not technicalities, but when somebody talks about $125 billion, you had a change of secretaries and you had change of chairman. This chairman didn't want to pursue it, and the secretary didn't want to pursue it, and I can't follow that. But what I'm saying is we spent a year, we met with almost 80 executives in and out of the department. We worked well with Dave Tillotson, and I give him a lot of credit. I give Bob Work a lot of credit, and I give the McKinsey team a lot of credit, and I give the most credit to Kenny Klepper. These guys bled their life for this for a long time.
Mr. Stein, I'm trying to get real clear here. This is a slide deck. Is this the final report, or was there a different report that was
I have not
published?
seen that. I have not seen it. I've not.
We'll hand it to you.
Yeah.
Let's now go to Ms. Demings of Florida is now recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillotson, in your testimony, you indicated that after the recommendations from the study or report came out, that you did address some IT inefficiencies, but that you did not go as far as the study recommended. What are some examples of some of the other recommendations that you chose not to implement?
So actually, it's not so much that we didn't choose to implement. There's a time interval to get the work done to do the implementation. So in the report, slide deck, whatever version you'd like, in the report, there's actually work required to be done to go put the details into place. We started on some of the obvious things that actually Mr. Klepper and Mr. Stein have already mentioned, like data center consolidation. There's a broader set of activities that regard moving information into a cloud environment that we would need to pursue. We did look at contracts for enterprise license agreements, so we looked at some of those. So part of this is just time phase for implementation. We did take on consolidation of some of the medical IT systems. We abandoned some of those, so there was reduced cost savings in that activity, and there is more to be done in that. We're actually continuing to work that. So we viewed this, much as, by the way, the recommendation of the DBB did, that this was going to take a period of time to do. Again, commercial time schedule, one thing, government time schedule, another, but the answer is it is not work that ends, it's work that goes on.
Mr. Klepper, you said the money is there, but can we get the agency out of the way to move forward? What did you mean by that?
You know, as I go in there and look at this enormous waste at a time where, no matter where you want to spend the money, we see this happening, and there's like this sense of helplessness. We can't fix it. I just have to believe if we could show the aggregate economic impact to the nation, not just the Defense Department, but these budgets are fungible, as you know, they bleed over into other areas, that if we could identify the savings, with clarity show the roadmap to fixing things, to getting to the savings, and identify for Congress those things that we need Congress to help us with. A lot of this is unintended consequences of policies and laws to solve one problem that created big inefficiencies and bureaucracies. It just happened. Nobody's ever measured that. So nobody's ever seen the aggregate historical financial consequence of those things over many years. So I believe, you know, maybe I'm an optimist. I just believe that there's so much money here, and we are so desperate in need for these funds. If we can make the case to Congress and to the leadership of the Defense Department of the things that we need help with, that people will help us. Now, are we going to go from a very little savings that we had in the 2 years since this study was published to 125? There's more than that. Or is it going to be somewhere? I think the answer to that range between, you know, Scott's 60 to 80 and where I think we have a real possibility is in, can we work together to move self-imposed barriers out of the way, so let us do that. And I just believe we can. I'm not ready to give up.
Mr. Korb, as you know, last week the Trump administration released the budget proposal that would increase defense spending by $54 billion. At the same time, the budget would cut the State Department and U.S. Agency for Independent Development's base budget by 28%, the largest cut of a department besides the Environmental Protection Agency. As you know, our national security is paramount, but the Trump administration fails to recognize how these draconian cuts make America less safe. Last month, 120 retired generals and admirals wrote a letter urging Congress not to slash the funding for diplomacy and international development. They stated, and I quote, "The State Department, USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, Peace Corps, and other developmental agencies are critical to preventing conflict and reducing the need to put our men and women in uniform in harm's way." Mr. Korb, would you agree with that statement?
I certainly would agree, and I would also add the Environmental Protection Agency, because our military leaders have said climate change is a threat to national security. And essentially, the Defense Department is not the only agency that provides for national security. as you pointed out, all of these other agencies do contribute, as military people know full well.
Thank you. When he was commander of Central Command, Secretary James Mattis spoke to members of Congress stating, and I quote, "I would start with the State Department's budget. Frankly, they need to be as fully funded as Congress believes appropriate, because if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately." Mr. Corb, would you agree with Secretary Mattis's assessment?
Absolutely, and I hope that he continues to make that case to the President now that he's a cabinet officer.
Is it fair to say preventing military conflict through diplomacy would cost less than engaging in it?
Very definitely.
Foreign aid is a popular target for those who say they want to seriously cut down on waste. However, many Americans may not realize foreign assistance makes up less than 1% of the federal budget. Mr. Corb, is that right? Are there national security implications that result from slashing foreign aid for our allies or humanitarian efforts?
Very, very definitely.
The Trump administration says that these extreme budget cuts for diplomacy are about putting America first, but America has a lot to lose if we stop making smart investments for our own global security. Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you gentlemen for being here today. Mr. Tillotson, in the course of evaluating savings and a lot of the other things, I want to try to get back to some of the evaluations that were examined. How many positions currently filled by contractors could be filled by uniform active duty personnel?
I can't give you a number, and I would also answer that I would not necessarily fill those positions with uniform personnel. In some cases, if we were going to replace them, we would fill them with contractors, or pardon me, with civilians. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Congressman, the issue that we're faced with in the department is to look at the appropriate labor mix, and I do think one of the things that I'm in complete agreement with Mr. Klepper, Mr. Stein on is an aggressive review of our contracts to just see whether we need them at all.
Well, I think there's a whole array of issues,
Yes, sir.
non-deployability, efficiency, base salary. I mean, there's a number of things that we can see for efficiencies. And I'm just surprised that you would not have any type of estimation of a number. I mean, since we're saving money by keeping contractors, which I would dispute, we ought to have some idea of what percentage or what numbers that some of that might be. We see a continued decline on our military personnel, and yet we see a continued increase in bloat of the bureaucracy. Do you not see that as a problem, Mr. Tillotson?
I do see that as a problem, Mr. Russell, and I agree with you that what I don't agree with is I don't see that the contractors are necessarily a savings. I think if I hire a contractor for a very finite job and they're done, then that's cheaper than hiring a full-time employee of any kind.
Unless they can't perform the mission.
Unless they can't perform the mission, in which case it's inappropriate. I agree.
And Mr. Rutherford, in your analysis with McKinsey, you looked at a wide array of things. Did your baselines show any savings by replacing contractors with uniformed personnel, or what those mixes might be? Or did you examine any of that? I know you did examine both military and contracting personnel. Did you see any saving there?
We do. When we did our comprehensive assessment on the actual savings, we looked at the different business processes. We looked at them at changing demand management, changing actually the contracts within themselves, and renegotiating those where you can do automation like Mr. Klepper talked about. We did not look at whether or not you could replace contractors and military personnel. What we looked at is where the compressible spend was within those different areas, and that there was opportunities for savings within the contract services.
And Secretary Corb, if you don't mind me using that title, in deference to your long service to our country, and I actually remember when you were in that capacity as a young soldier. When you were serving in the Navy, was it possible for a seaman to do a contracting personnel job more efficiently with less expense? I suspected you might say that. And I guess, Mr. Clipper, I'm just amazed at your background and how you've been able to rescue what should have been destroyed and yet is resurrected from, unfortunately, the ashes. As you evaluated the structural and management processes of this problem, did you determine that there would be any efficiency and savings by replacing contractor functions with military personnel as a way to get at net saving?
No, sir. What we actually did was a little bit the opposite. We looked at productivity and savings, and we did not touch any uniform positions. So if you look at all the savings that we listed, they were all non-military, non-uniform.
Was this assuming, though, a steady line of military units, or did it take constant folding of flags and mothballing of ships and parking of aircraft?
I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, okay, so as you're studying this and you're looking at, yeah, maybe we want to keep this contractor, but as you lose a unit, then did you take that into account, or was it a steady state of in-strength that you made these evaluations on?
We made it on a steady state of in-strength. So we took, if I may just for a second, the math was we took the prior year, which, by the way, an important point here, was 2013 actual. So the study needs to be updated. But we took 2013 because I needed a full year's savings, and we extrapolated that over a 5-year period for productivity.
Well, and I would argue, and having spent a career in the military myself, from 2013 to 2017, we've diminished our armed forces a great deal, and we are putting our republic at risk in its defense. I would be the first to say that we need to reform contracting, we need to find saving. But I also think that when you pay a specialist E4 or a seaman E4 or something like that, a sailor at $24,000 to $30,000 a year, they can probably do a personnel job cheaper than a contractor. Would you agree with that or not?
I would, and just if I could build on that point, the other piece that is the really big lever here is automation and compute power, where you have a higher intellectual worker versus low-end people doing papers and things. And I think there, the opportunity for military personnel to self-serve is sort of an aspirational state that you would design to. So they can configure the changes they need without filling out forms and sending it back to, come back months and months later to put self-help. And that, if I were going to increase the amount of service that uniform did, I'd do it through upping the intellectual level of value and providing the automation tools that they could interact with much, much more